One of the most valuable things I have ever come across was a piece of philosophy that made me realize it's irrational to hate people or even dislike them. And at the time I came across this philosophy, there were people I hated. I was at uni, but my mind did often wander back to this evil duo on my school bus in high school who would throw fruit at me and cut off pieces of my hair during our commute. It's kind of traumatic. They were older, and there were two of them, and they wanted the back of the bus. And as someone who was very stubborn, and that's something I think I have outgrown, and as someone who also had a problem with being told what to do, which is something I definitely haven't outgrown, I felt like it was my right to sit at the back of the bus, and I sat there because they said I couldn't. And I would try and reason with them using words. And they would say, "Shut up, nerd," and hit me in the face with a backpack. And eventually it just wasn't safe to catch the bus anymore, and I ended up having to walk. And I hated them. And I also hated this guy who I thought was trying to steal my girlfriend. And I also hated some uni administrative staff who were being total pains about my academic transcript. And I hated various other people I'd heard about who sounded awful, like Pol Pot. And don't worry, this isn't going to be an essay defending Pol Pot, but I do want to share an interesting philosophical idea that I think can help you totally free yourself from hate, which is worth attempting, as hate is not an emotion that will make your life better, and that's not my idea. As the great Albert Einstein said, hate is a disease that corrodes the vessel that carries it. Now, controversially, I actually do think hate has some strange benefits, which we'll talk about another time, but it's almost certainly overall a net negative in your life, and it can be very freeing to completely get rid of it. So let's think about a hypothetical situation. It's a bright, sunny Saturday morning, and through your window, you see your middle-aged neighbor Steve washing his Subaru with his little infant kid, Sarah, running around, playing with the hose, having a great time. So you decide to do something nice, and you go over to Steve and say, "Steve, I just made a big batch of pour-over black coffee with Ethiopian grounds I just picked up from the market. Why don't you come over and share a cup? And I've got a cookie for Sarah." And Steve comes over, and he picks up his mug of coffee, and he looks at you dead in the eyes, and proceeds to pour that coffee over the white rug you got from your mother-in-law as a wedding present. And you say, "Steve, why did you do that?" And Steve just flips you off and walks out with Sarah. Now, the first thing you'll do in that situation is try and find a reason as to why Steve did this. Did you insult him somehow? Is he going through a messy divorce? Does your lemon tree grow over his side of the fence? What did you do to initiate this behavior? But if through your examination you find that Steve's action didn't have an adequate justification, you're just not going to like Steve anymore. And you're going to spend the rest of your day being very upset that Steve threw your nice gesture in your face and ruined your rug. But if the exact same event occurs, except this time instead of Steve pouring the coffee on your rug, it's infant Sarah who grabs the mug of coffee off the table and just throws it everywhere. Well, you might think to yourself, infants do that kind of stuff sometimes. They don't know any better. Now, in both scenarios, you have a ruined rug. But it's easy to hate Steve for his decision to ruin your rug. And it's hard to hate Sarah for her impulsive and typical infant behavior. And that, I think, is a core difference, because when we're dealing with adults, we attribute everything they do to a conscious decision. And when we're dealing with tiny little kids, we don't attribute their behavior as conscious decisions. We allow them a lot of leeway and attribute their behavior to underdeveloped cognitive function. When it comes to really tiny kids, we don't treat them like they have total free will. We assume that a lot of the time, if they do something wrong, it's not because they weighed up their options between a kind action and a malicious action, and they thought long and hard about which one to do and chose to be malicious. They were just being little kids who did what they did because of their tiny little kid brain. But at some point, we decide someone's mature and we decide to hold people fully responsible for their actions. But I'd like to posit, what if we're all essentially little kids who act without deciding to do what we're doing? If you truly believed that Steve couldn't control himself pouring that mug of coffee on your rug, would you still hate him? It seems wrong to hate someone for doing something they have no control over. What if we're all infants in that sense? This is where you end up if you are open to the idea that free will might be an illusion. It sounds kooky and spooky and disempowering, but let me leave you with a quote from Sam Harris's book Free Will that might start to change the way you see things. Sam says, "Take a moment to think about the context in which your next decision will occur. You did not pick your parents, or the time and place of your birth. You didn't choose your gender, or most of your life experiences. You had no control whatsoever over your genome or the development of your brain. And now your brain is making choices on the basis of preferences and beliefs that have been hammered into it over a lifetime by your genes, your physical development since the moment you were conceived, and the interactions you have had with other people, events, and ideas. Where is the freedom in this? Yes, you are free to do what you want, even now, but where did your desires come from?" End quote. So something that we all accept is that we are some combination of nature and nurture. Nobody would say that an evil person is responsible for their nature, their genetics. So we just have to fill in what's left of why they became evil. And all that's left when you remove genetics is everything that that person has experienced. And again, I'm not here to defend Pol Pot, but what does someone like Pol Pot end up looking like if he's born with the same genetics, but as a Gen Z in 2005 to a rich family from the Sydney Northern Beaches who are really into surfing? And instead of being part of an activist cohort sharing ideas about communism and isolationism and Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, the people around him are just talking about the pros and cons of fiberglass surfboards and how often to wax them. He still might end up being a guy you don't want to hang around. He may still have asshole DNA, and he may still get into activism or even extremism one way or another. But there's simply too many different environmental conditions for it to be reasonable to expect Surfer Pol Pot to become a genocidal dictator. Who knows what accumulation of experiences and circumstance brought him to be in that position? And I've just been down a Pol Pot Wikipedia hole, so this is why he's on the top of my mind. But for example, he wasn't academically gifted and he was held back in school for 2 years. Now that could have created an inferiority complex. That could have been something he spent his whole life compensating for. But imagine if he grew up in an Amazonian tribe where nobody goes to school. Does he ever develop that same inferiority complex? You know, this is all obviously just wild speculation, but what isn't speculation is that who we are changes to some degree with every single thing we experience. Genetics isn't the whole picture. And if you were able to use a supercomputer to input every single thing someone has experienced and added that to a perfect picture of their genetics, you would be able to perfectly calculate their next action. Because their next action can only be a product of their experience and genetics. There's no other variables to include. So, you may argue, that's all well and good, but watch me decide to do something of my own free will right now. Go ahead, do something now. Decide to clap or drink some water or do something I haven't said. Go exercise your free will. Okay, so hopefully you did something or decided to do nothing. Both would apparently be an exercise in free will. But I think, again, Sam sums up beautifully why even the decision you just made is also an illusion of free will. And again, I'm taking this from his book, Free Will. He says, quote, "You can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. I'll say that again. You can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. End quote. So whatever you decide to do appears in your mind without you deciding to make that decision appear in your mind. There's always one step where you weren't in charge, where you can't figure out how that idea popped into your brain. If, in response to me asking you to exercise your free will, you raised your arms. Why did you raise your arms and not raise your eyebrows? You didn't go through every possible decision available and decide raising your arms was the best one. You just decided to do something, and that's what you did. The reason you didn't do something else is because of who you are. And who you are is because of your genetics and your parents and the time and place of birth and everything else that has ever happened to you. So how do we bring this all back to Steve? Well, if you afford Steve that same logic, the logic that you're affording yourself, you realize that Steve, because of his genes and his environment throughout his whole life, could not have done anything else but pour coffee onto your rug and flip you off. It wasn't his fault. That's just who Steve was at that moment. Steve had no control over the situation, just like an infant. So is it right to hate Steve or anyone else who has done you wrong? How likely is it that my bullies from the bus had some gene or experience that made them so aggressive and obnoxious in that moment? Well, it's not likely. It's just the truth. They are their genes and their experiences, and that made them awful people for a little period of time. So there's no point hating them. But here's a key thing to remember that might make you feel a little bit better. Just because free will appears to be an illusion doesn't mean you have to invite Steve over again. In fact, that would be crazy. If someone can't help but do bad things, that doesn't mean you have to be okay with those bad things. That's why we have prisons. And prisons are compatible with no free will, because you simply can't have bad people doing bad things in regular society, even if what they did wasn't their fault. But there's a core moral difference. You don't have to spend any energy hating them because they couldn't help but be who they are. And you shouldn't feel an urge to punish them because they couldn't help but be who they are. Punishment might be necessary for disincentivizing someone from doing the action again, or for disincentivizing other people from doing bad things. It works to effectively change people's environment and experiences so that deciding to do something wrong doesn't end up being their fate. But punishment shouldn't be punitive, or at least simply for the sake of causing harm to the person who did something wrong. We don't hold the criminally insane responsible for their actions. And with this worldview, every single criminal act is just the result of having some kind of mental health problem. If insanity just means you're not totally in control of your actions, then we're all on the spectrum of insanity. So if someone cuts in front of you in a queue, you can just think of them as a tiny little tinsy bit criminally insane. But I can't tell you how much this has made my life better, because every time someone wrongs me, and I can think of a few occasions where someone's done something really bad that's taken a long time to get over, down to something minor, like taking my parking spot. Anywhere on this spectrum, when I manage to be mindful of the fact that I'm enraged, and sometimes I pull this off and sometimes I don't, but if I can get a hold of myself, then rather than stay angry, I can just try and think about the hundreds of tiny inputs that are out of their control that have led up to this moment where this person has taken those actions. And that saves me a lot of energy and anguish, because I don't believe that someone has just randomly chosen me to be the victim of a malicious, deliberate injustice. Bad people still suck. But that layer of intent is gone. Because if they had bad intentions, they didn't decide to have the bad intentions. Lots of people have likely caused you a lot of pain. And nobody is saying you have any obligation to rekindle those relationships or even forgive anyone who has hurt you. But it just adds this small degree of peace, in my opinion, to know that the bad actors in your life didn't choose, in a conventional sense, to be who they became. I'm Jonah Primo. This is the Overexamined Life. See you next time.